What if the story that we've been told about human civilization is incomplete? Not some completely false giant conspiracy made up by historians and archaeologists, but simply just incomplete. What if thousands of years before Egypt and Mesopotamia and the first civilizations we learn about in school, human beings had already developed far more deeper knowledge and organization than we currently give them credit for? And what if a major catastrophe destroyed much of the world, leaving only fragments behind? This is the possibility that Graham Hancock has spent decades exploring. And depending on who you listen to, he is either one of the most prominent alternative thinkers of our time or a brilliant storyteller who has built an enormous theory without enough evidence to actually prove it. So, which one is it? Is Graham Hancock actually onto something? Or are people being seduced by a story simply because it seems more exciting than the expected version of history? Because to me, I find Mr. Hancock absolutely fascinating. I enjoy listening to him. I enjoy the podcasts he's on, and I think it's absolutely a great thing to learn about and to listen to. I like that he questions assumptions, examines the ancient sites, and refuses to accept that our current understanding of the past must be the final version. But enjoying somebody's ideas and believing they have proved them are actually two big different things. And I think ultimately the distinction, as with most things, gets lost almost every single time or in every conversation about Mr. Hancock. So let's look at actually what Mr. Graham Hancock believes. Hancock's central argument is that an advanced civilization may have existed during the last ice age. He believes this civilization possessed sophisticated knowledge of subjects such as astronomy, navigation, construction, and mathematics. Then, roughly 12,000 years ago, the world experienced a period of severe environmental disruption around and the beginning of the Younger Dryas. Around the beginning of the Younger Dryas. Hancock believes a major cosmic event may have contributed to this catastrophe and destroyed most of that civilization. According to his broader theory, some survivors then travelled across the world carrying parts of their knowledge into later cultures and helping to inspire and develop monumental architecture, agriculture, and civilization at large. That is pretty much the basic idea behind much of Mr. Hancock's work and his Netflix series, Ancient Apocalypse, which I found to be absolutely fascinating, well made, and a good watch, essentially. Netflix currently describes the program as Hancock traveling globally in search of evidence for mysterious, lost civilizations dating back to the Ice Age. It is an incredible story, a forgotten civilization, a global catastrophe, survivors preserving ancient knowledge, flood myths appearing in cultures separated by enormous distances, monuments that seem far too sophisticated, far too advanced for people we once imagined that were living at the time. It has everything. But a compelling story is not automatically a true story. Why Hancock's argument appeals to vast amounts of people. I think that part of the attraction is that we already know our understanding of history can change. Archaeologists once believed certain human migrations happened later than the evidence now suggests. New discoveries have repeatedly forced experts to change their timelines and reconsider assumptions. Göbekli Tepe, for example, is a perfect example. The site contains monumental megalithic structures erected by hunter-gatherer communities between roughly 9,600 and 8,200 BCE, far earlier than people associated things with large organized construction. But this alone does not prove Hancock's lost civilization theory or that Hancock's lost civilization existed. But it does prove that people living thousands of years before we thought people were capable of building such things or constructing such huge, remarkable monuments without fitting the simplistic image of primitive humans wandering around doing little more than chucking a spear into the side of a bison's head. We also know that huge areas of ancient coastline are now underwater. Global sea levels are approximately 120 meters lower around the last glacial maximum than they are today. That's quite a cool phrase, I must say myself. So as the ice melted, vast coastal landscapes where ancient communities may have lived were submerged. So when Hancock says part of the human history may be beneath the ocean, that is not an absurd claim. That's bang on. There is undoubtedly archaeological sites underwater. There's undoubtedly many discoveries still waiting to be made. And enormous parts of our planet have not yet been fully excavated. The majority of the planet hasn't, let's be real. And this uncertainty creates room for possibility. And I think Hancock is very good at operating inside that space. He looks at what we don't know and asks, well, what could there be? Archaeology naturally has to ask different questions. What can the available evidence actually demonstrate? And that difference is at the center of the entire debate. With all that being said, obviously there are weaker points in Hancock's arguments, and I think the major problem is not whether intelligent or sophisticated human life existed during the Ice Age. Of course, they did. The problem is the scale of the civilization that Hancock proposes. A civilization capable of traveling globally, spreading advanced knowledge and technologies, influencing cultures across continents, should presumably leave behind more than suggestive similarities, myths, and unusual monuments. We'd expect settlements, tools, trade networks, waste, evidence of food production, shipwrecks of maritime infrastructure, distinctive objects appearing across the globe, across different regions all around the world. Some recognizable archaeological trail connecting these populations. Archaeologists argue that enormous numbers of Ice Age sites have been studied, yet this material record of an advanced global civilization has not yet appeared. So during a lengthy discussion with archaeologist Flint Dibble, Hancock acknowledged that within the areas archaeologists have studied, there is currently no direct evidence of advanced civilizations he proposes. Dibble's argument was that archaeology is not based solely on spectacular monuments. It is built from patterns across vast quantities of ordinary evidence, such as food remnants, tools, pollen, settlements, and discarded materials. That doesn't prove such a civilization could never exist. Of course not. Absence of evidence is not always evidence of absence. But when the theory becomes this large, the lack of direct evidence begins to matter somewhat. You cannot fill every missing piece with, well, maybe it was destroyed, maybe it's underwater, maybe this, maybe that, maybe archaeologists haven't looked into the correct place. Those possibilities might explain why evidence is difficult to find, but they cannot become the evidence itself. So what about this big catastrophe then? The Younger Dryas was a real period of abrupt climate change near the end of the last ice age. The disputed part is the suggestion that a comet or fragmented cosmic objects caused the event and destroyed advanced civilization, which may well be the case. Some researchers continue to investigate evidence they believe supports an impact or airburst. However, major scientific criticism remains. Peer-reviewed research has challenged whether the proposed impact markers were deposited simultaneously across the world, which is an important requirement for the hypothesis. So it would be wrong to say that Hancock's catastrophe theory has been conclusively proved. But it would also be fair to say that the scientific discussion is more complicated than simply laughing at anybody who dares to ask a question about the particular period. There was a dramatic environmental change. We know this. Human populations were affected. We know that. Sea levels rose enormously across the broad end of the Ice Age. We know this. Land disappeared. We know that too. And species became extinct, and species continue to become extinct all the time. The world experienced transformations difficult for us to actually fully imagine. So the question is whether those real events actually destroyed the specific advanced civilization that Hancock describes. So far, that final link has not yet been demonstrated. Hancock frequently presents himself as an outsider, challenging an establishment that is unwilling to reconsider its beliefs. I understand why that message connects with people. Someone on the outside of the system, this is always going to connect with the people, because often people feel outside of the system. They feel like the establishment is against them in some way or another. Institutions can become defensive, and experts can become arrogant, and people with qualifications can dismiss ordinary curiosity instead of explaining why that they disagree. History contains plenty of examples where accepted ideas were later overturned. But I don't believe that thousands of archaeologists around the world are collectively hiding evidence of a lost civilization. Archaeologists would have an enormous professional incentive to discover something that completely rewrote human history, essentially. Finding a genuine Ice Age city, advanced maritime network, or unknown civilization would be one of the greatest archaeological discoveries ever made. It would create careers rather than destroy them. I think so anyway. I'm not saying that's the case for all archaeologists. I'm not saying that's the case for everybody around the world, but I just think there'd be more people tooting this pipe if it was actually something worth tooting. But heck, I don't know anything. Archaeology does change when solid evidence appears. Göbekli Tepe wasn't buried again because it challenged an old assumption. It became one of the most important archaeological sites in the world. So when they discovered Göbekli Tepe, it's not like they chucked mud back on it and be like, "Whoa, we don't want to discover this because it might disprove something that we earlier said." It's become one of the most world-renowned sites. The better criticism is probably not that archaeologists are covering up the truth, it is that some of them have communicated badly, behaved dismissively, or underestimated how strongly people want to actually understand the deeper human story about human civilization, about lost potential civilizations. And Hancock stepped into that gap and he's done it exceptionally well. He made prehistory exciting for millions around the world. And I think this is something which matters a lot. You know, it has huge amounts of value, even when his conclusions go further than the evidence supports. And I think it's all part of the fun, being able to draw conclusions or, come up with hypotheses and say exciting things, essentially, because ultimately we don't know, do we? My verdict on this whole thing, I don't think he has proved advanced global civilizations existed during the Ice Age, then seeded later civilizations around the world. There are interesting mysteries. There are gaps in the knowledge, gaps in the history. There are submerged landscapes. Surprising ancient sites, and parts of human history that we are still yet waiting to discover. But the possibility is essentially not proof. And at the same time, I don't think the correct response is to ridicule everyone who finds his work interesting, because I find his work interesting. Curiosity is super healthy. Questioning and accepting ideas is healthy. Exploring alternative possibilities is healthy, and it's good for the world at large and everybody who lives in it. The danger begins when questioning evidence becomes a substitute for producing evidence. I like listening to Graham Hancock because he makes the ancient world feel alive again. He reminds people that history is not finished. A lot of people tend to think that, oh, well, history is a closed book. They've wrote the pages and that's it. But that's definitely not the case because, there's more to know than what we do know. So, he reminds people that history is not finished, which I think is important, big time. There's still discoveries to be made, theories to be challenged, and enormous questions to be answered. I think the most honest position is somewhere between blind belief and automatic dismissal. Maybe Mr. Hancock has identified genuine mysteries but connected them too confidently. Maybe the civilization he imagines was not global, technologically advanced, or responsible for everything that followed. Perhaps ancient humans were simply more organized, more intelligent, and more capable than earlier generations of historians actually realized. And that possibility is fascinating. And that's kind of where I lean. I kind of lean on the idea that, people of past, people of old, perhaps were probably more advanced than what we give them credit for, at least certainly anyway. A lot of the time, like I said earlier, when you speak to somebody about human beings 15,000 years ago or longer, people just tend to assume, cavemen running around with spears throwing them at bison. But that's probably not the case. I mean, of course, it is in some places in the world. Hunter gatherers, we were that for a long time, and we still are in some places in the world. But there definitely, to me, is signs of some type of advanced civilization. I don't mean advanced in alien technology, flying saucers to the moon and that, but advanced in that doing things we are not giving them credit for. Graham Hancock may not have rewritten human history, but I think he's convinced millions of people to look at it again. And perhaps that is why the debate around him is not going away, which I'm glad it's not. So I think what I would ask of the good viewer is, well, what do you think about Graham Hancock? Have you listened to anything he's done? Do you think he's onto something? Or do you think the evidence simply is not there? Let me know in the comments below. This is Jake O'Neill Talks, honest commentary on modern and ancient life.